Even as I begin this sermon on Theodore Parker, you know a lot about him. And I must tell you that it has been a delight to have Theodore Parker accompanying this past week instead of Adolf Hitler, who accompanied me the week before. They both have much to teach us, but I prefer Theodore Parker. I think I would have loved to know him. I would have wanted, if I had lived in Boston, to belong to one of those lively groups of people of which he was a part, who would gather in Boston and talk about their ideas. Such people as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, those people were a part of those groups. And I wonder, thinking about this song and about his vision of religion, I wonder how can our light go everywhere? And I believe if we asked Theodore Parker that question, he would talk about an inner light, that we are each to offer our own light. And then he would have told us that if we can each offer our own light, that we could become a part of a light that would go everywhere. As I said in the children's story, Theodore Parker was born in 1810. Those of you who come from an LDS background might be interested to know that Joseph Smith was born in 1805. And that their backgrounds in many ways are quite similar. He was born into a rather poor family, a poor farming family in rural Massachusetts. He was the last child of 11. His mother was 46 when she had him. And from the beginning, he was drawn to learning. His family would get together in the evenings and read, and his mother was able to recite poetry, these long poems. My grandmother could do that, but then I think it kind of ended with her generation. Not very many people spend time memorizing the sonnets of Shakespeare and all of this poetry that used to be not read, but recited. His childhood taught him, number one, I believe, the importance of learning, but it also taught him to survive sorrow. As I said in the children's story, his family was decimated by tuberculosis. By the time he entered ministry, 7 of his siblings, 7 out of 11 were dead. And this is not uncommon. But the death of his mother, and those of you who have experienced the death of a parent in childhood, that death stayed with him. And I believe it played an important role in the development of his theology. For him, the existence of God was essential. Around that, he asked many questions. And sometimes I want to talk about what Theodore Parker thought of God. Who was this God he envisioned? Because I think that God was very different from the one I rejected 30 years ago. But this is part of a bigger, much bigger conversation, maybe many sermons, so I'm not going to go into that. But I think it's important to understand that his God was one who brought comfort because he needed comfort in order to survive. This last week, I've been diving into his biography that is called American Heretic. Don't you love having a religious ancestor who is called a heretic all these years later? And in that book, I learned all kinds of things. I discovered, and I don't want you to spread this around, that Theodore Parker was not perfect. He was a workaholic. I told the children about those 300 books he read that included multi-volumes, and they were in, what I didn't mention is they were in Latin, Greek, German, French. I think he could read 20 different languages. And in 1840, his New Year's resolution was to do nothing imperfectly. I wonder how he felt about that in February. But I think we know something about he had an incredible perfectionism. He studied the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, and he was especially interested in the miracles. And he also became impassioned to try to figure out who was the historical Jesus. He began to wonder if Jonah had really lived in that whale for 3 whole days. I believe that the pivotal moment for him in his theology, or one of them, I cannot say the only one, but one of them, was listening to Ralph Waldo Emerson's sermon. This sermon, and I encourage you to read it, I know that our library must have a copy, but this sermon that he gave to the Harvard graduating class is very, very important to our denomination. Everyone, you'll read it and you'll think, I don't know why the whole of Boston and all of the Unitarians got so angry at this sermon, but they did. In this sermon, Emerson talks about the spiritual deadness of the church. He even recounts this. He tells the story of a minister who's standing giving a sermon, and everyone is really bored. And he says, outside was falling a meteor of snow that minister didn't even notice. This sermon deeply influenced Theodore Parker because I believed it made him trust in the truth that had been bubbling up within him. And he began to bravely speak that truth. He became impassioned with what was permanent, what he saw as permanent in Christianity, not what he saw as unimportant. His disbelief in miracles, in the actuality of those miracles, did not lessen his belief in the importance of what was being said. What I find wonderful about Theodore Parker, one of the many things, is that his theology transformed through his whole life. His personal searching shed light into areas that had long been held without question. And there were a lot of people in those dark places that did not like his flashlight. And most of the ministers, the Unitarian ministers of Boston, hated him and would not allow him to come and preach at their church. Let's remember that this was an exciting time on earth, when great minds were questioning and opening to things that we now think of as, we do not think of them, well, some people do, because I'm mentioning Charles Darwin, but I think most of the people here probably do not find what he said to be strange or hateful. But this was a time when Charles Darwin, in fact, Charles Darwin was born only 1 year before Theodore Parker. John Muir was born in 1838. Emily Dickinson, whose poetry I love so much, was also born during this time. It was a time of lots of people breaking rules. And I brought up Emily Dickinson because she broke the rules of poetry and imagery in ways that excited me when I found her in the library of my junior high school at 13. Her words still spoke to me then. and still do today. In 1837, he became aware of slavery. I think he probably always knew it was going on, but it's like so many things for us. All of a sudden, our eyes open to something. Mine have done that about restaurants this year. They open to injustice, and at that time, there was awful slavery that was accepted in so much of our country. And to Theodore Parker, Jesus' life and teachings and the vision that he had of God would have hated slavery. He felt that Jesus would have been very clear on what to do with slavery. But at that time, the privileged people of Boston, many of whom called themselves Unitarians, had fortunes that depended on the cotton industry that was dependent as well on the cruelty of slavery. Their beautiful homes, although so far away from plantations, their refined lifestyles were directly linked to slavery. Last spring, Tucker Gurney introduced an initiative for our Unitarian Universalist General Assembly about divesting from fossil fuel. I can report to you that that was unanimously passed by the Assembly in June. It is still true, though, that our own investments, the way we spend our money, and if you open your eyes to this, it might make you a little crazy, but we are all attached to destructive practices or aims, even though we are not the ones who are making those sweatshops in Bangladesh. We must be vigilant as Theodore Parker, and as we are being through our restaurant group, and Shannon, Shannon is heading this, we're going to restaurants and asking about what the wages are there, the possibilities of moving up in the restaurant, because restaurant workers generally only receive $2.13 an hour. And instead of just stopping going to restaurants, we're investigating them and talking with them about how they could possibly change. These are modern examples of what was happening in Theodore Parker's Boston. I believe that is probably why, truth told, I prefer to live in Walden Pond. I love living away from all of these reminders. I loved living in the countryside and in the desert. But even then, we cannot escape our responsibility to act. When I would go for a walk in the forest during the years I lived in Japan, and this was my joy to walk in the forests that were around our house, I would start to get really bothered because of all the garbage. So what I would do, because farmers would they'd be driving along, and they were my beloved neighbors. They'd drive along and just throw things out their windows. And when they wanted to move something in their house, they would take it to the forest and dump it. And the people who sold our house to us had a car dealership. So at one part of the forest was filled with parts of cars and old chairs. So even when you go to the countryside, you cannot avoid it. All of these things are always around us. And as Theodore Parker's theology was deepening, so was his commitment to justice, especially to abolitionism. he became an abolitionist at a time when abolitionists were being mobbed and even lynched. And that is how we see him in our Unitarian Universalist. Our image of our past is sitting, writing a sermon with a gun on his desk to protect the former slaves who are in his home. Many of you have had theological struggles that have been entwined with a desire for justice. Theodore Parker wondered, how can Christians accept slavery? Many of you have asked, because I have heard you, you have asked, how can people of faith accept inequality because of sexuality? And I am proud of the justice seeking that brings you to this sanctuary, and that is embodied in Theodore Parker. Many of you have followed your consciences to come through those doors. It is thought that Theodore Parker died from his workaholism. He just kept going. And finally, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1859. He spent the last 15 months of his life traveling, and he is buried in an English cemetery in Florence, Italy. His light remains with us. I believe that we are doing the work of Theodore Parker in this community. I believe we are doing things he would have been happy to hear about. He would be glad that we just gave an offering that is towards saving our canyons. He would be glad that our desire for clean air in this valley has urged us to buy electric cars or fuel-efficient cars, or take buses or ride bicycles, or I am hearing of solar panels multiplying like rabbits in this sanctuary. But I also realize that buying those things, perhaps except for the bus pass, are out of reach for many people. And I think he would say there are always ways you can make a difference. In the meals that you are preparing for homeless youth, I am copied on those emails. And I'm so happy when I hear all of those replies. People saying, I can do it 3 days. And I can feel how much you want to take what you are feeling in this sanctuary out into the community and making a difference. I believe that when we worship together and we listen to what is happening in the world, and we listen for the joys and sorrows of the people around us, I believe that if we do not go out and do things that are making a difference, that we will become depressed. I don't think we can sit here comfortably unless we go out there and do what our consciences are calling us to do. One small act can change the world. I am blessed as the minister of this congregation to hear your stories. And among those stories, I hear of youth who are stopping bullying, who stop things that are happening on Facebook that are cruel and say, you should not say that about that person. That person is my friend. We each have opportunities to spread justice, and I believe at the heart of justice is kindness. On Friday night, and Lou is off in Arizona packing up more things, so I am alone in Salt Lake City right now. But on Friday night, I went to a hilarious theater performance. And on my way home, I realized I had to buy something. My very large cat, Henry, was running out of cat litter. And those of you who have cats know what that can mean. And unfortunately, Henry doesn't like all kinds of cat litters. He only likes that one that comes in the very, very heavy box, the clumping kind. So I entered an unfamiliar supermarket, and at first I had parked, and I don't like to park next to people because I just don't. I find it easier to park when there's more room around me. So I kind of parked in a corner of the parking lot, walked in, and as I walked in, the lights in the parking lot were dimming. They were giving us the message, we're closing. So I didn't know, this was unfamiliar, I didn't know where the cat litter was, and I found somebody who worked there. And I said, would you please help me find cat litter? And he said, I'll take you there, ma'am. And how many cats do you have? I said, one large one. Which kind of litter would you like? I pointed at the 43-pound box. Would you like me to take that to your car, ma'am? And he picked it up. He took me through self-checkout, which I always avoid. And then he carried the box to my car. And as we were walking, I asked him, how was your day? He said, chaotic. I love chaos. And then he asked me, what is your cat's name? Henry. I said, what about you? My favorite of my 6 cats is Mr. Meow. And then he put the cat litter in the back of my car and said, have a nice evening, ma'am. And he disappeared back into the store. And I was blessed. I felt connected to the world, to someone, a stranger who had a cat named Mr. Meow, and he had helped me navigate 2 difficult things. He'd helped me go to the corner of a dark parking lot that I wasn't familiar with, and he saved me from wrenching my shoulder with that box. And for him, it was all part of his day. I wonder how many things we can make just a part of our day. Just as that young man, Gage, in Florida, tied the shoes of an old man who was standing in the supermarket where he was working, and somebody caught it on video. That's what he said, something like, it was just a part of my day. It was just something, I didn't think it was that important. Small acts are important. They bless other people. If each of us did that, and I know many of you already do because you have done those things to me, I believe if each of us were anxiously engaged in even these small acts in addition to these larger acts, that light would emanate from this place. Our Unitarian Universalist religion or community would become the dream of Theodore Parker. It would become a source of light like sunshine. Theodore Parker's life teaches each of us that through actively developing our gifts as he did his scholarly ways, and through divining our own consciences, to listening to that voice within us that is saying, why don't you help that person? Or, you know, I don't feel good going to this restaurant because I'm not sure that all these people serving me are able to stay out of poverty even though they are working 50 and 60 hours a week. I believe that if we follow our own consciences, that we will give light and hope to the world around us. And together we can be a religion. And we are being, I believe, a religion like sunshine that goes everywhere. May it be so. Amen.